So have you ever wondered about other faiths? Other faiths like Judaism or Islam or Buddhism, or what is this whole thing about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or people that we call Mormons? Too often in our lives, I think that we look at these other faiths that are either kind of all around us or maybe we're kind of isolated from, and we start to double down on ours. We just don't learn about them. We just throw up a shield and say, well, I'm right and they're wrong, and I don't even want to know anything about the in-between. Well, this week here on the Daily Dose, what we're going to do is we're going to tease apart and talk about some of the basic tenets of some of these other faiths and what we can learn about our faith from their faith experience. I'm so glad that you're here. So today, we're going to talk about Judaism. What can we learn about our Christian faith from our Jewish brothers and sisters? Well, first of all, we all have the same ancestor. We all trace our lineage to the same guy named Abraham, who was born maybe 4,000 plus years ago. Abraham, he becomes the father of really three religions: Christianity, Judaism, and then later Islam, which we'll learn about later on in this series. But we trace our history to Abraham. Now, Abraham, he is living in the country, and all of a sudden he has this encounter with God. And God promises him three things. God promises, 1, descendants; 2, land; and 3, blessings. So Abraham, he takes his wife, Sarah, and they go out into the wilderness. They leave the land of their people and they kind of trudge out onto their own. And this is a really important part of what it means to be a person of the Jewish faith. You see, God made these promises, and in the Bible, we actually call that a covenant. It's this promise between Abraham and God. This promise is so strong that Abraham is leaving behind his support system to go out and follow this God that's promised these three things. And so when Jewish people relate to the covenant, they see this as the biggest promise because they are people of the covenant. Eventually, Abraham and his wife Sarah, they kind of make their way through the land. And remember, that first promise is descendants. The descendants, they don't come. And then they end up past childbearing years. And so Sarah, she just can't wait on God's covenant anymore. She can't wait on God's promise. So what she does is that she tells her husband, Abraham, that he can take her slave Hagar and then have a child with her. So Abraham does, and then this creates tension between the two women. But his firstborn son of Abraham and Hagar is this child named Ishmael. Now he comes important later. But then later, after many, many years of being barren, and finally they've sort of given up that God's going to keep God's promises at all, Sarah does become pregnant. And then she has this child named Isaac. So now we find this family tree continuing to go on. Isaac then gives birth to 2 boys, to twins, Jacob and Esau. And then we follow the line through Jacob, who ends up having 13 children, which becomes a really big deal and becomes eventually known as the people of Israel. Jacob ends up getting his name changed to Israel after having this wrestling with God in the wilderness. And then the name Israel actually means he who struggles with God. So Israel starts to become the Israelites, the people of God that are part of this covenantal promise. Here's the most interesting thing about Abraham. Abraham, in this time, some 4,000 plus years ago, he was the first person that we really know about to identify as that there was one God. We call this monotheism, the one God. And this was opposed to the culture all around them of polytheism, of many gods. Think way back to your high school English class where you studied all the different Greek gods or all the different Roman gods and all the conflict that they had between them. All of a sudden now, with Abraham, with his insight and his revelation, with his covenant, there's one God. And this one God wants to have a relationship with Abraham and wants to have a relationship with people, wants to have a relationship with each and every one of the descendants that are going to come after them. So now our Jewish brothers and sisters, they are called the Israelites, but sometimes they end up being called later the Jews because they're part of the tribe of Judah, which is one of Israel's children. Sometimes we also call them Hebrews. The only really place that the name Hebrews comes from is from chapter 16 in Genesis, and the word Hebrews actually means to cross over. So when you're talking about Jews or Hebrews or Israelites here in the church and around, we're all talking about the same group of people. It gets a little bit confusing. So back to the covenant. All right, so this covenantal promise between people and God. And this covenant starts to take this physical shape. And God ends up giving Moses the 10 Commandments. God has freed God's people from slavery in Egypt. So God has freed the Israelites to go and be with God in the wilderness. And they don't know what to do with themselves. They go from the strictness of being slaves in order to the freedom of the wilderness, to freedom under God. I want you to think about it like, some kids, when they have a really strict upbringing and those first 6 weeks of their freshman year of college, they just kind of lose their minds and start trying to do everything. So what God does is God gives them some commandments. God gives them the 10 Commandments through his work with Moses. And what's really fun about this is that the 10 Commandments, sometimes I think we, maybe if you call yourself Christian, I think we read them as kind of restrictive. Thou shalt not, you shouldn't do this. But instead, for people who have just been freed, those 10 Commandments, they can act as kind of a guardrail, as a way for them to be safe with themselves, a way for them to keep their covenant with God, a way for them to protect their relationships with other people. It's not this restrictive sort of thing, but instead it's this gift of grace so that they can live into this beautiful community that they have made together. As you keep reading some of the Old Testament, which is our Jewish scriptures, you'll start to read some things where they're kind of teasing out a little bit about how to be in community together, especially there in the wilderness. Sometimes when you read, you start to get some kind of weird things in there, things like don't eat owls or don't boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. But I want you to read those and think about things like this is a community that is newly sort of formed and they're worshiping one God. They don't have to make sacrifices to all these different gods, but instead they're learning how to live as people together. Some of those health laws, they're actually there just to protect the people, protect them from kind of bloodborne illnesses and other diseases that you can get. So when you're reading those, think about the context in which they were written. These are people trying to figure out how do we be people together in peace and in harmony with each other and with God. All of these laws, they're summed up in what our Jewish brothers and sisters call the Shema. And we can read this in Deuteronomy chapter 6. And it's this beautiful, beautiful text. It says this, it says, Hear, O Israel, that the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commandments I give you today are to be in your hearts. Impress them on your children. Tell them about when you sit at home and when you're walking along the road, when you lie down and when you get up, to put them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. What I love about this is that it kind of sums up the law. The law is to love the Lord your God and then teach it to your kids. When are you going to teach it? Well, you're going to teach it when you're lying down and when you're standing up. You're going to teach it when you're at home and when you're away. And then you're going to put it in prominent places, like on the doorpost, on your hand, on your forehead, if you need it. You're going to have all these places that remind you that you are being taken care of, that you're being provided for by God, by the God of the universe. If you ever visit a Jewish country or one of your Jewish friends, they might actually have this little box on their door frame of their house, and it's called a mezuzah. And when inside that little box is this Shema written on a little scroll and tucked in. It's this little reminder that whatever you're going through, that God is your provider, that God is the one directing your life. I was at a conference one where I got to speak with a Jewish rabbi, and she had some really interesting things to say to me about what a gift the law was. Like I said, I think sometimes as Christians, we think of the law as something that is kind of keeping us captive. But what a gift the law is when we interact with other people, how it keeps boundaries, how it's like a marriage covenant that keeps each other kind of working in the same direction together. So friends, there's a lot of things that we can learn from the Jewish faith. Number one, God is personal. God is personal and active and interested in humans flourishing throughout history. That God has work for us to do together, and God is part of that work. Number two, community matters. Coming together to celebrate rituals and history and tradition, it's part of how we are wired as human beings. In this prayer and solidarity, we can learn that from our Jewish brothers and sisters. And number three, the law. It's actually a gift of grace. It's not this thing that prohibits you from doing one thing or the other thing, but it's a way to free you in order to be able to love God and love other people fully. Thanks so much for joining me today. I hope you learned something.